I never gave much thought to the lease. It was just another piece of paperwork, another set of obligations we had to deal with every month. Pay the rent, pay the utilities, make sure everything was running smoothly. That was the routine. Our apartment was nothing fancy, just a decent two-bedroom in a quiet part of town. The kind of place where the neighbors nodded at each other in the hallways, but never asked too many questions. A place that felt safe, familiar. The rent had always been low, suspiciously low. I remember being surprised when we first signed the lease, but Emily had brushed it off, saying maybe we just got lucky. Maybe the landlord, Mr. Grayson, was one of those rare, decent ones who didn't try to squeeze every dime out of his tenants. He was an older guy, polite, always around when something needed fixing. A little too helpful sometimes, but I figured that was better than a landlord who ignored everything. But luck had never really been my thing. That thought didn't hit me until the night I found the lease buried under a pile of old documents. I was looking for something else entirely, a receipt, maybe, or one of those forms we kept meaning to file. But when I pulled it out, my eyes landed on the rent amount, and something about it made my stomach tighten. It was too low, way too low. I wasn't stupid. I'd seen what other apartments in the area were going for, and what we were paying wasn't even close to normal. At first, I told myself it was just one of those weird breaks in life. Some landlords kept their rents low to avoid high turnover. Some just didn't care enough to keep up with market prices. But something about it didn't sit right. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the numbers. The longer I looked, the worse it got. Then I saw something else. A note, handwritten in the margins, almost too faint to notice. Mutual agreement between the landlord and tenant to adjust terms as needed. I blinked. What the hell did that mean? I'd signed a lot of contracts in my life, and I knew that phrase wasn't normal. I flipped through the lease again, scanning every page, looking for any other odd details. But that was the only out-of-place thing. That, and the fact that our rent was less than half of what it should have been. Something gnawed at the back of my mind. I took the lease into the living room, where Emily was curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when I walked in. "Did you know about this?" I asked, holding the lease up in front of her. She barely glanced at it. "Know about what?" "The rent," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "It's too low. Way too low." She shrugged, the same way she always did when she wanted me to drop something. "Maybe Grayson just likes us. Maybe he's lazy about raising rent." I stood there for a moment, watching her. That was the first lie. I didn't know it yet, but looking back, I should have caught it right then. The way her eyes flickered toward the lease and then back to her phone. The slight shift in her body, like she was adjusting herself, trying to look relaxed. But she wasn't. She was waiting to see if I was going to push. And I did. The next couple of days, I couldn't get out of my head. I went through all our payments, comparing them to other listings in the area. The numbers didn't add up. They weren't even close. Then I started paying attention to other things. Things I'd ignored before. Grayson was around a lot, more than a landlord should be. Not just for maintenance, but for random check-ins. Stopping by to see how things were going. Asking if we needed anything fixed. Always at times when I wasn't home. A pattern started forming in my head. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Then, one night, I decided to test a theory. I told Emily I'd be working late, but instead of heading to the office, I parked my car a block away from our building and walked back, keeping to the shadows. I found a spot where I could watch our entrance without being seen. Then I waited. The minutes dragged. An hour passed. Then another. And then I saw him. Grayson. He wasn't carrying tools. He wasn't holding any paperwork. He wasn't knocking on the door. He had a key, and he let himself in. Something inside me snapped. My hands clenched in a fist at my sides, my breath slow and controlled, my entire body rigid. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, a dull, steady thud. But I didn't move. I stayed exactly where I was, watching, waiting. A few minutes later, the light in our bedroom flicked on. And that was it. That was all the proof I needed. I knew, and the rage started building. I stood outside that building for what felt like forever. The cold night air pressed against my skin, but I barely noticed. My mind was locked onto one thing, the light in that bedroom window. The bedroom I shared with my wife. The bedroom where Grayson had just walked in like he belonged there. My hands curled in a fist so tight I could feel my nails digging into my palms. Every rational part of me screamed to storm up there, kick the door in, and end it right then and there. But I didn't move. Not yet. Because I needed to see. I needed to be sure. Maybe it was self-torture. Maybe I already knew the truth, but just wanted to make it hurt even more. Whatever the reason, I stayed rooted to the spot, my breath slow and controlled, my jaw locked so tight I could hear my teeth grind. The light in the bedroom stayed on. Minutes stretched into eternity. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, each thud a countdown to something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. My mind played out scenarios, each one worse than the last. What were they doing in there? Talking? Laughing? Touching? I forced myself to stay still. Forced myself to wait. Then movement. A shadow passed by the window. Two shadows. One taller than the other. My stomach twisted. I didn't need to see more. I turned on my heel and walked away, fists clenched at my sides, shoulders so tense they ached. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, my vision narrowing. I didn't even realize I had walked half a mile down the street until I stopped at a deserted bus stop and leaned against a metal pole, my head spinning. My wife, Emily. I'd known her for almost a decade. I thought I knew every little detail about her. How she liked her coffee, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the stupid little humming noise she made when she was lost in thought. And now, none of it meant anything. I wanted to go back. I wanted to storm into that apartment and drag Grayson out by his throat. But something held me back. Not fear, not hesitation. Hatred. Pure, seething, burning hatred. Not just for him, but for her. I knew people cheated. I knew it happened all the time. I'd read the stories, heard the rumors, seen the way people's marriages crumbled around them. But I never thought it would happen to me. That was the kind of arrogance that made you blind. And I've been blind. Blinded by love, by trust, by the stupid idea that if you gave someone your loyalty, they'd give it back. I let out a slow breath and turned back toward the apartment. I wasn't going to lose my mind. Not yet. I needed to think, needed to be smart. Storming in right now would accomplish nothing. Emily would deny everything. Grayson would slither away, all smug and satisfied. No, I needed more. I needed to make sure that when I confronted her, there was no escape. No room for her to wiggle out with half-truths and lies. I took the long way back, circling the block, letting my thoughts sharpen into something cold and calculated. When I finally reached our building again, the bedroom light was off. Grayson was gone. I climbed the stairs slowly, forcing myself to breathe evenly. When I stepped into the apartment, Emily was exactly where I had left her. On the couch, her phone in her hand, her expression perfectly neutral. Like nothing had happened. Like she wasn't sneaking around behind my back with the landlord. I stood in the doorway for a long second, watching her. She didn't even look up. Then I moved, walking past her into the bedroom. I scanned the room. Nothing looked out of place. No sign that another man had just been in here. The bed was still made. Her nightstand was undisturbed. But I knew better. I walked over to the closet and pulled open the door. My side was as it always was, shirts neatly hung, shoes lined up at the bottom. Her side looked the same. At first. Then I noticed it. A smell. Faint, but there. Cologne. Not mine. I reached up and touched one of her jackets. A leather one she hardly ever wore. The sleeve was slightly wrinkled, as if someone had grabbed it. I exhaled through my nose, my pulse steady, controlled. I wasn't ready to call her out yet. Not without something undeniable. Not without a way to crush every excuse she might throw at me. So I turned, walked back to the living room, and sat down across from her. She finally looked up, flashing me that familiar, practiced smile. "Hey," she said, like nothing was wrong. Like she hadn't just betrayed me. "You're home early." I just stared at her, and for the first time, I realized something. She didn't feel guilty. She wasn't nervous. She thought she had gotten away with it. And that made my blood boil even more. I sat across from her, watching, waiting. The air between us felt too normal, too casual, like this was just any other night. Emily stretched her legs out on the couch, yawning slightly before glancing up at me. "You okay?" she asked, tilting her head. She was good. I'd give her that. Her voice was steady, her expression unreadable. If I hadn't just seen what I saw, I might have believed her. But I had seen. I had stood outside in the cold, watching another man enter my home, my bedroom, using a key he wasn't supposed to have. I had watched their shadows move against the thin curtains, and now, here she was, looking at me with those same familiar eyes, pretending nothing was wrong. My stomach churned. I forced myself to lean back, making a show of rubbing the back of my neck. "Just a long day," I muttered. Her lips twitched into a slight smile. "Want me to get you something? A beer?" I stared at her. There was again that ease, that casual kindness, like she wasn't hiding something beneath it. I shook my head. "I'm good." She went back to her phone, scrolling, as if I wasn't even there. My fingers dug into the arm of the chair. Every instinct screamed at me to just throw the truth in her face, to tell her I knew, to watch her expression shift when she realized she'd been caught. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I stood up, stretching as if I were just another exhausted husband calling a night. "I'm going to take a shower," I said, my voice even. She barely reacted. "All right." I walked to the bedroom, shutting the door behind me, but I didn't turn on the water. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on my knees, staring at the closet. The scent of cologne still lingered in the air. Not mine. I let my eyes move over the room, looking for anything else. Anything I might have missed earlier. The bed looked the same, but the sheets, something about them felt off. Too smooth. Too perfectly tucked. Had she made the bed after he left? I reached down, gripping the corner of the comforter, and peeled it back. The sheets underneath were crisp, but the pillows, hers, had the slightest indent, like someone had been laying there recently. I clenched my jaw. I should have expected this. Should have seen it coming. But betrayal is funny like that. It doesn't just hit you all at once. It creeps in, lingers in your bones, until every little thing you once ignored suddenly has meaning. I stood up, moving to her nightstand. It looked normal. Her lamp, a book she'd been meaning to finish for months, a glass of water that was half full. Then I spotted it. A single strand of hair. Short. Gray. Grayson. The rage bubbled up again, but I forced it down. I needed more. I moved to the bathroom, flicking on the light. The counter was as it always was. Her makeup bag, toothbrush, a bottle of expensive lotion she swore was necessary. And then, in the trash can, something that didn't belong. A condom wrapper. I stared at it. We hadn't used condoms in years. A slow, seething heat crawled through my chest. That was it. The final nail. The undeniable proof. I gripped the edge of the sink, knuckles white, my breath coming in slow, measured inhales. My own reflection stared back at me, expression dark, unrecognizable. She really thought I was that blind. I turned off the light and stepped back into the bedroom. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional soft clicking of her nails tapping against her phone screen. I could walk out there right now, throw the wrapper at her, watch the color drain from her face. But no, not yet. I needed to hear her lie to me. I needed her to look me in the eye and try to wriggle out of it. I took another slow breath, schooling my face into something neutral before stepping back into the living room. Emily glanced up. "Shower already?" I nodded. Wasn't in the mood. She shrugged, her attention already drifting back to her screen. For a long time, I just watched her. The way she sat, legs curled up, completely comfortable in her deception. And that's when I realized something. She wasn't just cheating. She was comfortable with it. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't on edge. She had done this before. Maybe not with Grayson. Maybe it was him, or maybe he was just the latest. Either way, she wasn't worried about getting caught, because she thought I would never figure it out. That was her mistake. I let a slow breath slip past my lips before speaking. "Hey, she hummed in response, eyes still on her phone. "You ever notice how cheap our rent is?" Her fingers stopped moving for just a second. A flicker of hesitation. Then she laughed lightly. "Oh, that again? Babe, we've been over this." I nodded, pretending to think. "Yeah, it's just weird, though, right? I mean, it's really cheap." She shrugged, the same way she always did when she wanted to steer a conversation away. Maybe Grayson just likes us. Maybe Grayson just likes us. I felt my teeth clench, but I forced a small smile. "Yeah," I said slowly. "Maybe." She didn't know. Not yet. But soon enough, she would. I sat there, watching her, feeling something cold and sharp settle in my gut. A slow-burning hatred. She thought she was untouchable. She thought I was a fool. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my face unreadable. I said casually, I was talking to a guy at work today. He's looking for an apartment. I told him about our place. Emily glanced up from her phone, but just for a second. Yeah, I continued. Told him how good the rent was. He couldn't believe it. Said he was paying almost double for a place smaller than this. She smiled. See, we got lucky. I let the silence drag out a little too long, just enough for discomfort to creep in. She shifted slightly on the couch, tucking her legs under her. Why are you bringing this up again? I gave her a half smile, shaking my head. No reason. Just weird, How we got such a great deal. And how Grayson's always around. That got a reaction. A quick, barely noticeable twitch in her jaw. Her fingers tightened slightly on her phone. What's that supposed to mean? I shrugged. Nothing. She studied me for a second before turning back to her screen. You're overthinking things. Maybe. Or maybe I've just been underthinking things for way too long. I stood up, stretching as if shaking off the conversation. I want to take a walk. She looked up again, a small furrow between her brows. At this hour? Yeah, need to clear my head. She hesitated, like she wanted to say something, but then just nodded. All right. I grabbed my keys and left, my movements calm, measured. But the second the door shut behind me, my breathing changed. Heavier. Controlled. I wasn't just going for a walk. I had a destination in mind. Grayson. His building was just a few blocks away. Not surprising. Landlords like to stay close to their properties. I'd only been there once, back when we signed the lease, but I remembered it well enough. A small, older apartment complex, nothing fancy. I stood outside for a minute, hands shoved into my pockets, staring at the front door. I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't just sit in that apartment anymore, playing dumb. I needed to look him in the eye, needed to see it. I walked up the steps and knocked. A pause, then the sound of movement inside. A second later, the door opened. Grayson stood there in a t-shirt and sweatpants, hair slightly damp like he had just showered. His face flickered through a range of emotions, confusion, then surprise, then something more guarded. Hey, he said, his voice neutral. Everything all right? I tilted my head slightly, studying him. Yeah, I lied. Just had a question about the lease. He hesitated just for a second before stepping back. Sure. Come in. I walked inside. The place was neat. Minimal. Nothing personal on the walls, just a couple of framed pictures of generic cityscapes. The air smelled like aftershave and cheap cologne. I stood in the middle of the living room, glancing around. Nice place. He gave a short chuckle. Not as nice as yours. I turned to him slowly, locking eyes. Yeah, about that. Something shifted in his face. A flicker of something he tried to hide. I pulled the lease out of my pocket, the copy I had printed earlier before leaving the apartment, and unfolded it. You remember this? He rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, that's your lease. What about it? I pointed to the handwritten note in the margins. This part. Silence. His expression didn't change, but I saw it in his posture. A slight stiffening of his shoulders. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Weird clause, don't you think? Mutual agreement between landlord and tenant to adjust terms as needed. What does that mean exactly? He forced a laugh. Oh, that? It's just a formality. I add that to all my leases. Do you? Yeah. I took a slow step closer. So, if I call one of your other tenants right now, they'll have the same clause in their lease? His jaw tightened just slightly. Gotcha. I let the silence drag out, watching the way his hands twitched at his sides. Then I nodded, like I had just solved the puzzle. You know what's funny? I said. I actually did some digging. His eyes snapped to mine. I looked up other apartments in our complex. People are paying double what we are. And yet, you never raised our rent. Not even once. A muscle in his jaw ticked. I don't have to explain my business to you. No, I agreed. You don't. I let that hang between us. Then I leaned in slightly, lower my voice. But you do have to explain why you were in my apartment tonight. His face barely moved, but I saw it. That split second of panic before he covered it up. He tried to play it off, shrugging. I don't know what you're talking about. I smiled again, slow and deliberate. Come on, Grayson. We both know that's a lie. More silence. Then he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Listen, man. I took another step forward, cutting the distance between us. Don't man me, I said quietly. You don't get to act like we're on the same level. You're the guy sneaking into my home, sleeping in my bed, touching my wife. His mouth opened slightly, like he wanted to deny it. But he didn't, because he knew. He knew I had him cornered. I let the moment stretch. Then I took a step back, nodding to myself. All right. His brows furrowed. All right. Yeah, I said. All right. Then I turned and walked out. He didn't stop me. Didn't say a word. I didn't need to hear his excuses. I already had what I needed. Because now, it wasn't just suspicion. Now it was confirmed. And Emily had no idea what was coming. I walked out of Grayson's building, my pulse steady, my breath slow. My hands were still in my pockets, clenched so tight that my knuckles ached. I expected him to call after me, to try to explain himself, to throw out some pathetic excuse. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching me go. And that told me everything I needed to know. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had smelled, what I had found, what I had heard in the silence of my own home. But there was something about hearing the lie come straight from his mouth that made it all snap into place. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't wondering. I knew. Emily was cheating on me. With our landlord. The man who set our rent so low. The man who had a key to our apartment. The man who walked in my home when he thought I wasn't looking. A slow, seething hatred burned in my chest as I walked through the empty streets. The cold air did nothing to cool the fire in my veins. I could still see her face sitting there on the couch, so casual, so comfortable, acting like she wasn't stabbing me in the back. She thought she had me fooled. She thought I was blind. And that, more than the affair itself, was what filled me with rage. I wasn't just angry that she had done it. I was angry at how easily she had done it, how effortlessly she lied, how she didn't even have the decency to be nervous. I took the long way back to our apartment, letting my thoughts sharpen into something more dangerous. Because this wasn't just about catching her anymore. This was about making her pay for thinking she could play me for a fool. Back home, by the time I reached our building, the lights in our apartment were still on. I stood outside for a moment, looking up at the window. My home, the place I had built with her. A home that had been tainted by her lies. I forced my expression into something neutral and climbed the stairs, my footsteps slow and steady. When I reached our door, I pulled out my keys, but then I stopped. I stared at the lock. Grayson had a key. How long had he been using it? How many nights had he let himself in while I was at work? How many times had she looked me in the eye, knowing another man had been in our bed? I shoved the key into the lock harder than I needed to, twisting it with more force than necessary. The door swung open, and I stepped inside. Emily was still on the couch. She looked up, her expression unreadable. That was fast, she said. I closed the door behind me, locking it. Changed my mind. She shrugged, going back to her phone. Cool. She was too comfortable, too relaxed. She thought she had gotten away with it. I moved past her, walking into the kitchen, opened the fridge, grabbed a beer, twisted the cap off, and took a slow sip. I needed to set the stage. I needed to make her think everything was fine. Then I leaned against the counter and said, "You ever think about moving?" She blinked up at me. Huh? I took another sip of my beer. Moving. Getting a new place. She frowned. Where'd that come from? I shrugged. I don't know. Just thinking. Maybe we should start looking. The rent's nice and all, but maybe it's time for a change. I watched her closely. The way her fingers tightened around her phone. The way her posture stiffened just slightly. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Why would we move? She asked, her voice carefully casual. I tilted my head. I don't know. I guess I just don't like the idea of our landlord having a key. There it was. The split second of panic in her eyes before she forced it down. What do you mean? I kept my voice even. Grayson. He's got a key. He can just walk in whenever he wants. You ever think about that? She let out a small laugh, but I heard the forced edge to it. But it's not like he actually does that. I smiled. Doesn't he? She froze. Just for a moment. Then she laughed again, but this time it was weaker. What are you talking about? I took another sip of my beer, letting the silence stretch, letting her squirm. Then I set the bottle down on the counter, crossed my arms, and said, I saw him. Everything about her changed. The air in the room shifted. She swallowed. Saw who? I leaned in slightly. Grayson. Her lips parted, her eyes darting away for the briefest second. When? Tonight. Her phone screen dimmed, the glow disappearing as her grip on it tightened. I watched her. I waited. Then she forced another weak laugh. That's crazy. Why would Grayson? Don't. My voice was sharper this time. Don't insult me. Silence. She licked her lips, exhaled slowly. I don't know what you think you saw, but I saw him use his key. I cut in. I saw him let himself in. Her mouth opened, then closed. She was scrambling, trying to figure out how to talk her way out of this, trying to figure out how to make me doubt myself. She didn't know that I already had all the proof I needed. I pushed away from the counter, taking slow, deliberate steps toward her. She didn't move. I stopped in front of her, close enough to see the nervous flicker in her eyes. Say it, I said quietly. Her throat bobbed. Say what? Say what you've been doing behind my back. Her fingers twitched. You're being paranoid. I exhaled slowly. I thought you might say that. Then I pulled the condom wrapper from my pocket and dropped it onto the couch beside her. She stared at it. I watched the blood drain from her face. A long, heavy silence stretched between us. Then she whispered, Where did you find that? My lip curled. In our bathroom. Her breath hitched. I leaned in, lowering my voice. You really thought I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't figure it out? She was frozen, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. And I saw it. The exact moment she realized there was no way out of this. No more excuses. No more lies. She was caught. And now I was going to make sure she regretted ever thinking she could fool me. She sat there, staring at the condom wrapper like it was a bomb about to go off in her lap. Her fingers twitched slightly, her breath uneven. For the first time tonight, she wasn't in control. Good. I wanted her to feel what I felt. That creeping, slow-burning sense of realization. That moment when everything falls apart, when every lie unravels at once, leaving nothing but the truth behind. Emily swallowed hard, then finally looked up at me. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. I let the silence stretch. Let her sit in it. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. Finally, she took a slow breath, straightened her spine, and forced herself to speak. That's not mine. I laughed. A low, humorless sound. She flinched. That's your excuse? I asked. My voice was eerily calm. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, but my face, my body, steady, unshaking. Not yours. She shook her head quickly, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. No, I don't know how it got there. I tilted my head slightly, studying her. So what? Someone broke into our apartment, used the bathroom, and left a condom wrapper behind. Her jaw clenched. I don't know. You don't know, I repeated. She exhaled sharply, as if she were frustrated with me. Maybe it was left there a long time ago, and you just noticed it now. I let out another quiet laugh. We haven't used condoms in years, Emily. That shut her up. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap, her eyes flicking around the room like she was searching for an escape. I could see it in her face, the calculations, the desperate scramble to find a way out of this. You're being crazy, she finally whispered. I took another step closer, towering over her now. No, I said, my voice deadly calm. You just thought I was stupid. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. I don't know what you want me to say. I want the truth. She let out a weak, humorless laugh. You already think you know the truth. Nothing I say is going to change that. My jaw tightened. Try me. She was quiet for a long time. Then she inhaled slowly, straightened her shoulders, and finally, said something real. I made a mistake. I stared at her. A mistake. That was the best she could come up with. Not an accident. Not something out of her control. Just a mistake. A choice. A decision. A cold, calculated betrayal. How long? I asked. She hesitated. I took another step forward. How long, Emily? Her lips parted, then closed again. I could see the gears turning in her head, weighing whether or not to lie again. 3 months, she finally admitted. I exhaled slowly through my nose. 3 months. I had been living in this apartment, sleeping next to her, eating meals with her, while this had been going on for 3 months. and she had looked me in the eye every single day and pretended to love me. I forced my hands to unclench, pushing down the searing anger, threatening to explode. Why? She blinked at me. What? Why? I repeated. Why him? Why this? She swallowed again, her nails digging into her palms. And then she started crying. Not sobbing, not wailing, just quiet, pitiful tears sliding down her cheeks as she shook her head. I don't know, she whispered. I laughed again, shaking my head. That's bullshit. I don't, she snapped, her voice breaking. I wasn't thinking. He was there, and I don't know. I don't know why I did it. I scoffed. You don't know why? Really? She wiped at her face roughly, her breaths coming faster now. I don't know. I felt. Say it, I said, my voice colder than ice. She sucked in a shaky breath. I felt wanted. I clenched my jaw so hard it ached. Wanted, I repeated. She nodded, looking away, her hands trembling. You've been so distant lately. And he made me feel. You mean he gave you cheap rent? I cut in sharply. Her eyes snapped back to mine, wide, panicked. No, it wasn't like that. I tilted my head. Wasn't it? Silence. She had no answer for that, because she knew, deep down, that I was right. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had sold herself. For lower rent. For a few $100s a month. For convenience. The realization settled over me like a suffocating weight. It wasn't love. It wasn't even lust. It was just cheap rent. My wife had been cheating on me for a discount. I let out a slow breath, stepping back. My head felt clearer now, my vision sharper. She wiped at her tears again. Please, she whispered. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. We can. I laughed. I couldn't help it. I actually laughed. She flinched at the sound. You really think we can fix this? I asked, shaking my head. Her chin trembled. I want you out, I said, cutting her off. She blinked rapidly. What? You heard me. Her lips parted, then closed again. Where am I supposed to go? I shrugged. Maybe Grayson will let you crash at his place. She shook her head frantically. No, please don't do this. We've been together for so long. You don't want to just throw that away. You already did, I said flatly. Tears spilled down her cheeks, her entire body trembling now. Please. But I was done. Done with the excuses. Done with the lies. Done with her. I walked to the bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and tossed it onto the couch next to her. She stared at it, then at me. I met her gaze, unflinching. Pack. She didn't move. So I grabbed the suitcase, unzipped it, and started shoving her clothes inside. That got her moving. She reached out, grabbing my wrist. Please don't do this. Let's talk. I yanked my arm away so hard she nearly stumbled. You lost the right to talk to me the second you let him into my home. Her face crumpled. I didn't care. I stepped back, arms crossed, watching as she slowly started packing. Her hand shook. Her tears fell. But I didn't feel bad. I didn't feel anything. Not anymore. Because this wasn't my wife. This was just the woman who threw me away for cheap rent. She stood there, her hands hovering over the suitcase, tears streaking down her face, her breath shaky and uneven. Her whole body trembled like she wanted to collapse, but I just stood there, arms crossed, watching, waiting, because this was her mess, and I was done cleaning up after her. The air between us was thick with something ugly. The reality of what she had done was settling over her like a weight she couldn't lift. And for the first time tonight, maybe for the first time in our entire marriage, she looked scared. Not of me, of what came next. She sniffled, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Where am I supposed to go? She whispered. I scoffed. That's not my problem. Her eyes searched my face, desperate. Please, let's talk about this. I shook my head. We're past talking. Her fingers curled into fists. So that's it? You're just done. I let out a bitter laugh. You were done first, Emily. 3 months ago. Maybe longer. She opened her mouth, then closed it, like she wanted to argue, but had nothing left to say. Because there was nothing to say. She had already spoken loud and clear with every lie, every stolen glance, every moment she had let him walk through our door. I grabbed a suitcase and yanked it open. Pack, or I'll do it for you. Her face twisted, lips trembling, hands shaking. But after a long pause, she reached for her clothes. I watched as she pulled shirts from the closet, one by one, folding them mechanically like she was moving through a dream she wasn't awake for yet. Good. I wanted it to hurt. I wanted her to feel even a fraction of the humiliation, the rage, the disgust I had felt tonight. She sniffled again. Can we at least try? No, I snapped. Her whole body flinched at the sharpness in my tone. I took a slow, measured breath, tried to keep my anger from boiling over into something reckless. Because I wasn't reckless. Not anymore. She had expected rage. She had expected me to scream, throw things, fall apart. But she hadn't expected this, the cold, calculated finality of it. That's what scared her the most. She packed in silence after that. The suitcase filled up faster than I thought it would. A life, a marriage, reduced to a few piles of folded fabric and meaningless belongings. It was almost poetic. When she finally zipped it shut, she turned to me, hands clenched at her sides. Can I stay at least for tonight? I laughed. She looked at me, startled by the sound. No, I said, shaking my head. You don't get to sleep in my bed. Not again. Her lips pressed together, and I saw it. That flicker of defiance, of entitlement. Like she still thought she had a say in this. Like she still thought she could manipulate her way back in. I walked to the door, unlocking it with slow, deliberate movements. Then I turned back to her. Get out. She didn't move at first. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale, like she hadn't actually believed it would come to this. Like she thought I'd break. Like she thought there was still some version of me that would forgive her. She didn't realize that version of me had died the moment I saw Grayson step into my home. I jerked my chin toward the door. Go. She swallowed hard, then finally, grabbed a suitcase and walked past me. She hesitated at the doorway, gripping the handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. I stared at her, waiting, but I didn't soften, didn't cave, didn't ask her to stay. She exhaled shakily, then stepped out into the hallway, and I shut the door in her face. The lock clicked into place, the sound final and deafening. And then, silence. For the first time in months, maybe years, there was silence. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the door. I thought I'd feel relief. Thought I'd feel some kind of twisted satisfaction watching her walk away, knowing she had to deal with the consequences of what she had done. But all I felt was nothing, just emptiness. I turned, scanning the apartment. It looked the same couch, the same kitchen, the same bedroom down the hall. But now it felt different, like it wasn't mine anymore, like it had been tainted beyond repair. I walked to the couch, dropping down heavily onto the cushions. My body was exhausted, my head pounding from the weight of it all. It was over, but something gnawed at me, deep in my chest. Because this wasn't just about Emily. It was about the fact that she didn't even fight for me. She had lied, she had made excuses, she had tried to dodge the truth, but she hadn't fought. She hadn't begged me to stay. She had just packed her things and left. That should have made it easier, should have made it simple, but it only made me realize something worse. I had spent years loving a woman who hadn't really loved me back. Not the way I had loved her. Not the way a wife should love her husband. I let my head fall back against the couch, staring up at the ceiling. Tomorrow, I'd have to figure out what came next. But tonight, I'd sit in this empty apartment, in this empty life, and remind myself that the next time I love someone, I wouldn't be so blind.